The TeachPitch podcast. We are very excited to be launching a series of interviews for TeachPitch, a global community of 50,000 subscribers from over 205 countries to date. And for these interviews, we have selected a number of subscribers who have achieved great things. And by great, I mean amazing. Think of former presidents, entrepreneurs, people who've built hospitals, huge non-profit organizations, successful journalists, doctors, etc. And what all our guests have in common is that despite their great success, they've encountered many enormous challenges. So what were these challenges and how did they overcome them? That's what we're going to be talking about here. My name is Aldo and I'm massively looking forward and very grateful you can join us on this journey. So sit back, relax and download the podcast here.
The thing that teachers are uniquely well placed to do is to think about the thinking of the small human immediately in front of them, that last meter between them and the pupil, right? Like that's the bit that, AI, despite its promises, is still nowhere quite near. And the more time teachers are spending doing that, the better rested, frankly, teachers are, the more energy they bring to work in the morning, the better they're going to do at that job.
In this episode, we talked to our guest how he learned from the economic challenges his upbringing brought along. Growing up on free school meals only provided to the lowest income families in England and being forced to live in a caravan with his family, our guest overcame a lot of unpleasant class differences at a young age and made a career for himself. And then we talk about his platform, how it was launched at lightning speed during the Easter holiday of 2020 and grew into an entire organization that is helping millions of teachers in the United Kingdom. Please enjoy this interview with Matthew Hood, founder and principal of Oak National Academy. You hear it everywhere. The pandemic has unfortunately had many devastating effects on the essential pillars on which our society rests. Our day-to-day reliance on things that were previously considered obvious was suddenly interrupted. Overflooded hospitals, empty shelves in the supermarket, and deserted tubes and trains previously crowded with passengers. There have been many stories, also on this podcast, on how frontline workers in the healthcare sector did their utmost to ensure that nurses, doctors, and other hospital staff could continue to do their work. And today we're going to take a deep dive in how people stood up for education. The abrupt closure of schools in 2020 came along with a deep fear that this would mean the end of teaching and learning as we know it. Our own organization, TeachPitch, was able to play a small role to ensure that education could continue in countries like Ecuador and Albania. And today we're going to talk about which specific steps were taken in the United Kingdom. The government provided more than 1.3 million laptops and tablets to schools so children could learn from home. Another notable government subsidized initiative that stands out is the Oak National Academy. This online school, initiated by the Reach Foundation, was created in April 2020 as a rapid response to the coronavirus outbreak. More than 40 teachers and colleagues from leading education organizations came together to support schools' efforts to keep children learning. The Oak Academy to date delivered 130 million lessons. 86% of teachers recommended Oak to a colleague, thanks to its help in reducing workload and improving teaching and learning. In total, over 4.7 million people visited Oak in its first term, with an average of 220,000 users each day. Serious numbers attacking a serious problem. With the support of hundreds of teachers, sector bodies, unions and subject associations, Oak aims to continually listen to its users' feedback to improve and extend its range of free resources. And the online school will stay open for at least 2 more terms, also as the restrictions in the UK come down. This is what the Oak's principal, Matt Hood, recently announced in an article in the Times. Matt Hood is described as one of the most forward-thinking educators around. Matt previously worked on many levels in the education sector as a teacher, policymaker, and entrepreneur. Matt's initiative has had an enormous positive effect on education in times of crisis. Friend or foe, I agree with Schools Minister Nick Gibb when he says, the impact Oak has made and the good it has done for the sector and children is immeasurable, and we will now look for the best way to harness that for the future. Welcome, Matt.
Hello, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome, Matt. I was very excited that you said yes to coming on as a guest on this podcast, and congratulations with such a great initiative as the Oak National Academy. Wow, very big numbers flying around, 130 million lessons delivered, millions of people that you helped out. Take us back to the very beginning of things. Not so long ago, April 2020. What kind of brought this together?
I think it's important to take yourself back when thinking about the foundation of Oak National Academy. We'd just gone into the Easter holidays. Schools had been closed for a couple of weeks in the United Kingdom. We had this sort of 2-week period of respite. It was right at the start of the very first lockdown, and there was a national sense of wanting to make a contribution to help. A reasonably similar time, a national initiative asked the NHS asking for volunteers to go around to neighbours' houses and help deliver food opened, and 400,000 people signed up in the first 24 hours. It was a period of immense kind of collective generosity. There was lots going on in health, obviously, to prepare us for and help support each other. And there were conversations about what was education's response going to be? What is it that we as teachers and school leaders needed to do together to help each other through this particularly difficult time? The big challenge facing schools was, we knew that pupils were not going to be back in school for the majority of that summer term. So they were going to have, somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks. Schools needed to turn on a pinhead and switch their provision from in-class teaching to remote education. And that was an enormous challenge. And myself and Oak's co-founder, a head teacher called David Thomas, began a conversation where we figured we knew a small handful of teachers who, often by chance, were in the fortunate position of being able to provide pretty good quality remote education for their pupils. Maybe they were interested in technology, or there was someone in their school who was a big technology evangelist, so their school had been an early adopter of, Microsoft Teams or Google Classroom. Could we get a broad enough group of those teachers together and asynchronous lessons from those teachers that anybody would be able to use? If we were making a maths lesson for 30 pupils, well, it's not that much more difficult to make it available to 30,000, and 30,000 turned into 300,000 and turned into 3 million, and onwards we went from there. So in a very grassroots way, contacts were made between people, teachers were identified, we then needed technologists and communications and operations experts, and before we knew it, in about 8 or 9 days, we'd stood up our first 180 lessons, which covered that first week back after the Easter holidays. We repeated that process 10, 11 more times right across that first term.
Wow, because there's the idea, and you just mentioned the word grassroots, but then there's also the government stepping in with a significant grant. So did that go simultaneously, or were you first doing something after hours, or were you first doing something and then got the government involved, or how did that exactly work?
Yeah, so this is partly linked to previous roles that I have had or worked in, one of which was inside of the Department for Education on Policy. And very, very early, in the first couple of days, we had the support of government, and they were able to provide a £500,000 grant for that first term, the majority of which actually covered some of those technology costs, particularly the kind of hosting and bandwidth costs. When we were getting up to, a few million lessons a week streaming video, some of those costs become really significant. And it was those costs plus the kind of volunteer effort from the teachers and school leaders during that first term that allowed us to stand up the site and keep it available for everybody for free.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And so we're now at the first 180 lessons, you said.
For the Monday when schools reopened, our developers were working right through the night to get them live for Monday morning. And that then became a bit of a kind of production line. So the teachers worked that first week of the term to prepare lessons for the second week. And onwards, we went right throughout the term until the middle of July. Mm-hmm. It was at that point that we had a conversation with about 300 teachers and school leaders about, what the other side of our summer holidays what the new academic year was going to bring. And, it became very clear at that point that there was going to be some continued ongoing disruption. And we made the decision to keep Oak National Academy open. So after we'd done this kind of 11 or so weeks in a row of producing a few hundred lessons a week, we switched our model and spent 3 or 4 weeks over that summer holiday with a much larger group of teachers, about 350 in total, creating basically a version of the English national curriculum, just about everything that a pupil might study from the age of 4 to 16, and then work the rest of the summer to get those available on the site for the 1st of September when schools returned.
Wow. Just so our listeners understand, so we have an audience in over 205 countries, so many of them educators as well, but not all based in the UK. Could you talk a little bit about the education system in the United Kingdom specifically? So the lessons you designed were talking mainly for secondary schools, is that correct?
No, so for our primary education phase, so 4-year-olds through to 11-year-olds, and then 11-year-olds through to 16-year-olds. So we covered those 2 phases of our education system, so 4-year-olds through to 16-year-olds in total. We don't currently have any lessons for 16 to 19-year-olds, which is the kind of 3rd phase of the English education system. And I say England rather than United Kingdom because education in England is a devolved matter. So England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland systems are all similar but slightly different. So Oak National Academy is primarily for the English education system.
English. Okay, that's good to point out because I'm based in Scotland at this moment. Well, you mentioned it before, and this is where I have a question also on the basis of my experience of building a platform for teachers for the past 7 years, which is the symbiosis between teachers and technology. Because again, congrats on a great initiative. And also, in the article that you write in the Times, which just appeared yesterday, you also say, well, digital lessons are the way to go. But that's not really a novelty, is it? Teachers are already aware for a longer period of time that technology can do good things for them. What is different now, you would say?
So there was a piece of research that the London School of Economics did into commuter behaviours in London. We'll connect, I promise. And what this piece of research specifically looked at is what happens to commuter behaviours when there is a tube strike. So when the London Underground network closes, what happens to the behaviours of commuters? And what this study found was that about 1 in 20 people who use the Underground network to get to work each day actually become more efficient commuters after a tube strike. So the network closes, they're forced to find a faster and more efficient way to work, and about 1 in 20 people manage to find a better way. The system reopens again, 19 people go back to their regular route, and 1 in 20 finds a new way of doing it. And I think something similar has just happened in our education system. So, you could go into some schools and every kid having a device would be very normal. Teachers being adept at using Google Classroom or Microsoft Teams or some other platform would be very normal. Teachers bolting on other education tools and products, times tables, Rockstars is a great example. Setting, administering homework online, again, very normal. But there would equally be lots of schools where those things would either be patchy or non-existent. And I think what the pandemic has done is it has created conditions that have sped up technology adoption across the system as a whole, partly because actually in England, a duty was placed on schools through some regulations to provide a certain type and volume and quality of remote education provision. And teachers have got more confident and comfortable with it than they might otherwise have done. We've had lots of practice that we wouldn't otherwise have had. And the result of that is much broader usage of technology, and I think usage of it for a wider range of use cases than maybe was the case previously. One of the things that's really interesting about Oak National Academy's resources is we created them with this kind of remote education whilst the pupil was maybe self-isolating or schools were partially closed use case in mind. And actually teachers are using them for lesson planning, for homework, for CPD, for cover lessons. They've just taken them and used them in a range of ways that we never initially intended them to be used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I would even say it a little bit more firm, because in the countries that we worked, we basically saw that technology is the only way to continue the process of teaching and learning. So, if you like it or not, you're going to have to use it to make sure you can achieve sustainable educational outcomes. And before that point, you were basically able to wing it. So there were several levels of interest when it came to technology, which is indeed dependent on school policy, or could also be individual teachers' interest. Some teachers are just less keen on technology than others are. So those were things that we saw, but now this time it was like, well, there's only one way, and that's by using technology or a technology platform. Another question I would have, and then I'll stop with critical questions, is there were already lots of platforms out there, right? So why a completely new platform? And you've done a great job, so, I'm very happy Oak National Academy is there, but there are also lots of other great platforms already out there. Why not join forces with an existing initiative that was already out there and try to strengthen that initiative to grow it further?
So I think that in terms of the platform that's been built and the initiatives that are already out there, that was absolutely our initial intention. So the lesson slides, the document, and in fact, lots of the original infrastructure and technology behind the platform is built on Google's technology. We knew that in order to stand this thing up in such a short period of time, we were, yes, of course, going to need the teachers to create the lessons, but we were going to need to work with and lean on a whole range of different other bits of existing technology infrastructure and other organizations. So we worked with an organization called Screencastify. They're existing kind of a little bit similar to this system, right? A kind of meeting, recording, editing system. We obviously used lots of Google technology and infrastructure, and the site was built on lots of that. We worked with a video streaming provider called Mux. Part of the challenge there is finding someone who's not going to pepper your site with adverts. If you put your things on YouTube, you end up with advertising. So although the kind of front end presentation, if you were to look on our site, looks like, Oak National Academy and it's all skinned and it is beautifully branded, actually the particularly early technology that sits behind it was existing platforms that were already in this space that we bolted together in a variety of ways to make the lessons easily and freely available.
Okay, so in terms of the infrastructure, you use a lot of tools that were already out there and brought them together, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a technologist by background, but if you were to speak to some of our developers, they are strong advocates of this approach of finding different pieces of existing technology that integrate together really well, and the sum being greater than the individual parts.
Good. That's great to hear, and thank you for explaining that. We're going into your challenges because, as I said before in the intro, you're a lifelong educator, or you've been working in education your whole life. What I think is you have a very interesting personal story, because you grew up in a family situation where money was tight and you were entitled to free school meals, and you basically grew into a good education because you were a clever kid, so to say, but it was not because of your, economic background that it was given to you. Could you talk a little bit about that, just so people understand the challenges you encountered already at a very young age?
I think part of the challenge growing up was constantly feeling slightly out of place amongst my peer group and getting increasingly adept over time at finding ways of fitting in and integrating so that I didn't get called out for being different or shown up because I hadn't had some of those same experiences as some of my wonderful classmates who I'm, still very good friends with, but that come from slightly more advantaged backgrounds. And there is still flashes of that in life day to day. Someone will mention a character from a particular classical book that I didn't read as a kid, but that is sort of more widely read in certain societal circles. And I'll find myself slightly uncomfortably trying to figure out how to get myself out of a situation without identifying myself as someone who doesn't know that particular reference or that particular book. In each stage of my education, I was increasingly surrounded by people who had often a very different background to the one that I had. I think ultimately, actually, that's, served me incredibly well and certainly gives me a fire in my belly for the work that we do, particularly targeting our resources at pupils from low-income families. It has certainly kept me grounded and, it's one of the reasons, for example, why we battled so hard early in January to get Oak 0 rated, which means there were no data charges associated with using our lessons for pupils who are accessing through a mobile phone. If what we were expecting parents to do on pay-as-you-go mobile devices is pay each time they want their children to take part in a lesson, and indeed pay more than a wealthier family who have got an unlimited broadband connection, that was the same sort of social injustice I'd experienced growing up, and I wasn't prepared for that to be the case for the number of children that we had in England who were accessing education through those means. I suppose the final advantage, and this is something that I am a big advocate for amongst, teenagers, is that, relatively early on, when I was sort of 13, 14, I got my first formal job, and part of my kind of drive and work ethic comes from starting work relatively young, knowing and understanding, the value of the money that I was able to earn and the freedom that gave me to do things that I hadn't previously done before, in jobs and roles that are often quite humbling, right? It was highlighted to others that my background was different. At one point I remember having to, a form tutor asking who in the class was getting free school meals this year, and I had to put my hand up, and I was the only person in my class that put my hand up. With the exception of those moments, I think there's lots of things now that I'm really grateful for as an adult that I maybe struggled a bit more with when I was growing up.
Yeah. I'm thinking what was going through the mind of the teacher to ask that so publicly. He or she should have known that it comes with a certain label.
Stigma attached to it.
Yeah. What I think is interesting about this story is what it represents. And you also mentioned that in your challenge. You said that, it exposes still a big class divide that is present in England. And just, for our listeners to understand, the United Kingdom is also a nation that has schools like Harrow and Eton, which are the fanciest, most beautiful private schools you've ever seen, right? And these are more than 5-star hotel boarding schools with everything available to you on the level of education because, the money is available. And that's, I think, quite unique because I grew up in Belgium and the Netherlands myself, and both countries just have one school system. There's no private, there's no public, there's one school system, and it's very good, right? And it caters to the needs of rich and poor. So, I'm not going to lie, there is a class divide, but it does not express itself on an educational level. Yeah. Would you say that it is present on an educational level in England still?
Yeah, and the type of school that I went to sits somewhere in the middle, and, that divide that you're talking about doesn't express itself as much at primary education, but it certainly starts to express itself more at secondary education. So even amongst the private schools, there is still a very clear hierarchy of levels within that group, a general private school versus some of those elite. Ironically, we call them public schools, which is the most confusing thing ever. So our elite private schools get called public schools. They're anything but public schools. But yeah, like I say, your Etons, your Harrows, your Stows, like they sit right at the top of this social hierarchy.
Yeah.
And, there have been attempts to reform, but they've only gone so far.
Yeah. Would you say that Oak National Academy is a big equalizer? That it's free for everyone?
That's a great question. And I would love and like to think the answer is yes. I don't think it's quite that simple. So we deliberately made the site free to access. We have deliberately not placed any kind of login barrier in front of any of the resources to make them as easy as possible for pupils to use. You can access the lessons on any device that you could possibly think of. There are no data charges associated with watching any of our lessons. And when it comes to helping and supporting teachers, we've had about 40,000 teachers join webinars with us where we've explained how the site works, what they can do with the resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of our internal work on generating interest in those webinars, we target at schools that serve low-income communities. So we have done a whole range of things to make the site as inclusive and as accessible as possible. Everything is subtitled. There are British Sign Language on lots of our lessons. Like, the list sort of goes on and on and on. That said, in order to make the most of our resources, I think a few things are true. I think that, you need a device, and we still, despite shipping 1.3 million, have pupils who don't have access to their own device. A device in the household is what often gets measured, but if you've got 3 kids at home and 1 device between them, that's challenging. The second thing is that not all devices are equal. Pupils spend about half as long accessing lessons through a mobile device as they do through a laptop device. Your mobile phone is literally designed to distract you from the thing that you're intending to do onto watching reams of cats dancing on TikTok. So not all devices are equal. And the third thing is, I think that, one of the things that we know from schools is that the basic environment in which you're in and are able to study matters. And, even if you've got a device and it's a laptop and, you don't need data because Oak Zero rated, but you don't have a space at home where you can sit and pop your headphones in and concentrate and do your work. We are still at risk, I think, of potentially exacerbating a problem where we are better suited to helping those that already have than those that don't. And we continue to push and try to find ways of making ourselves, as easy to use and as accessible as possible for every pupil, regardless of their background. So I would like to think overall we've made a contribution to closing rather than widening gaps. But the picture isn't quite that simple, and I worry about that. And, it's something that leads the United Kingdom to a conversation about access to education, which it is not used to having. Lots of your listeners from around the world will be in places where access to education is still a very live topic, particularly access to secondary education or access to education for girls. We are not used to that conversation in England. We just assume that everybody can access. And I think the pandemic has shown us that actually, particularly during any kind of school closure or lockdown scenario, can you credibly say that you can access education in its fullest sense in England in 2021 if you don't have an internet-enabled device?
I'd like to refer to an earlier conversation that we had on this podcast series with John Wood, who's the founder of Room to Read, and he attacks global literacy. So he built schools all over the world through Room to Read. He raised over $650 million. He started the initiative around 20 years ago. And the number we're still attacking today of people who are illiterate and who shouldn't be is 770 million people on this planet because they don't have access to a quality education. So just to bring that number in kind of on a global scale, that's the numbers we're dealing with if you look further, if you broaden that scope. So there's lots of work to be done. But let's stick to Oak. Your second challenge, you mention building this organization, having a blueprint for an organization or an idea, but then literally having, less than 2 weeks to do it. And I can imagine that was quite a challenge. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, the period of time is a total blur. If you were to look at my diary for it, we were probably hitting about 100 hours a week, something like that, full pace to get this thing off the ground. And there was this sort of tipping point conversation where it was like, look, are we going to do this or are we not going to do this? When we decided to go for it. And from there, we were at full tilt to get this over the line. And making this kind of thing happen is a combination of 2 things, I think. The first is finding experts for the roles that are required. We needed in our original senior team a technology expert, a education expert, a communications expert. We were going to have to talk about this and tell people about it and explain it. An operations expert. We were going to have to run an organization and meet particular objectives. And I was just, incredibly fortunate to, over the past 10, 15 years or so, have built up a network of people, which meant that when David and I said, okay, yeah, let's do it, and David said, look, I'll focus on the education stuff, I was able to call up, find, identify, cajole, nudge, volunteer groups of people who were willing to step into some of these roles. And I knew they were the best at what they did. And not only did that mean they were able to deliver on their piece of the puzzle, it meant that others in the team, their peers, trusted them implicitly to deliver on their bit of the puzzle. And there was just not going to be time for, as you have in a sort of normal organization, you get your senior team together, everybody sort of discussing and inputting into other people's areas. There was just not time for that. Like, we just had to go and make decisions and move really quickly and do our best to kind of coordinate those things as they were happening. And without the right experts into those roles, we just would have been dead in the water from day one. So the first part of the puzzle is like, find, identify experts. You need to identify them. You need to bring them in. You need to get them going. You need to give them lots of freedom to get going. The second part of it, like, sounds really, then mundane, but is a, like, really routine, basic way of managing a project. We met every morning through that period of time. I don't even know what time, about 7:30 in the morning. And we met every evening, about 7:30 in the evening. And I think what we were able to do was keep a really high level of discipline around those structures and routines and rhythms that we put into place from day one, that meant that we had the structure in place when we got to some of those sort of slightly more crucial crunch points, like we were delivering it on day one. Mm-hmm. Third and final thing that I think I'll say is, like, we were ruthless, like absolutely ruthless in our identification of the minimum viable product. We had a short, sharp deadline, and what is the minimum viable product? Like, what is the least we can get away with to get a site up and stable, hosting 180 odd lessons by that first Monday back? And too often, I think, we are not ruthless enough about that prioritization to get us to that minimum viable product. And it didn't mean those things didn't come. Lots of them came. They just came a little bit further down the line. And it was that combination, I think, like a really structured routine, a team of experts, and a ruthless focus on prioritization to the minimum viable product. Combining those three things together with probably a huge dollop of goodwill and good luck, it's probably what got us over the line.
That's a remarkable story. I would like to add that it's, of course, also unprecedented times, right? Because there was a mission that you needed to achieve because all schools were closed. So I think that was also a driver that, if in normal times you build a platform and the MVP isn't there yet, you take another week, but you didn't really have that extra week. So it needed to be good. So that pressure must have also created some drive within your team to deliver and deliver correctly. Yeah. Thanks for sharing this second challenge. Highly interesting. And then your third challenge, which basically would also be my follow-up question, which is, what's next for Oak National Academy? So as your third challenge, you said, like, okay, I am now, the platform is there now. You've got funding, you've got follow-on funding from the government to do to create some more stuff, but you need to craft it into a culture and make it something that sustains. That's going to be my first question. Is that your aim? Do you want Oak to be around, also long after the pandemic and coronavirus restrictions are gone? So
one of the things, again, that we've done in recent times is gone out to teachers, again, our users, and indeed pupils as well, and tried to understand whether they think that Oak would be a useful contribution to the wider education system in non-COVID times. And, the majority of teachers come back and tell us that they continue to use Oak for a wide range of reasons and, want to continue to do that. There is also a kind of be prepared rationale for keeping the resources and the site available, because we don't know what's around the corner. And, should this happen again, I don't think any of us want to be in the position that we were in a year ago, right? Like, if the system as a whole can be more resilient, because we've been able to make it more resilient, then we should try to, hold on to some of those gains. So, I think Oak should be around for as long as it's useful for teachers and school leaders. And, they're telling us it continues to be useful for them. So, we'll continue to create resources for them that help reduce their workload and improve what it is that they're able to do in their classrooms. One of the hardest things to do in any organization like that, particularly an interdisciplinary organization where people come from different walks of life and are used to working in slightly different ways, is, creating the conditions where they can do their best work. And there are some things that I think I've learned over the past 10, 15 years about organizations culture that I try to bring with me into those future roles. I have a constant watchful eye on the growth of process and bureaucracy as organization grows. I think the normal pattern of organizations goes, you hire a group of really talented individuals who have lots of freedom and autonomy to do the things that they need to do. You also, in that mix, inevitably end up with some less high-performing individuals. Inevitably, one of those less high-performing individuals does something that is problematic. And the organization's response to that is often to put in process to manage the poor performance of that individual. A classic example is, somebody buys something that they're not supposed to buy on a company credit card. They maybe buy some beer in a hotel that they're staying over, and they're not supposed to buy beer because that's against the policy. The response to that individual is far too often, in my view, put in a process or write another policy about not buying beer, instead of having a difficult conversation and giving some feedback to that individual. And this process repeats itself over and over and over and over again in organizations, to the point that your really talented people who like the freedom and autonomy to work really well get so frustrated by the amount of bureaucracy and paperwork they often leave. And what you're left with is an organization with not the highest performing individuals and tons of bureaucracy. And, for startup organizations, it's really, really important early on. And I've got a brilliant operations team who are guarding against this as well. But we talk about the shortest possible rule book, working policies, work flexibly. Like, I don't want rules and regulations to get in the way of really talented people doing the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the operational model, and I 100% agree, don't make it too bureaucratic if it's not needed. To a certain extent, it comes with the growth of an organization, because I'm just thinking about things like onboarding people and, negotiating, their pay and, any kind of additional things that come into place. As you say, bills need to be paid as well. So at a certain point, the HR components kicking in and, so that they just make it a little bit more bureaucratic than just a group of excited people coming together and working on something. One thing I would have is if you were to grow further, have you looked at how to make it sustainable? Because everything's for free now on the platform. So there is effectively no business model, is there?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges of the kind of future conversation, and is the reason why we're in conversations with the Department for Education about what the future of Oak National Academy might look like. They've extended our current funding by 2 terms. And one of the options that we're exploring with them is whether or not this being taken into some form of public ownership is a route to answering that sustainability question. There is no appetite from teachers when we talk to them, although, of course, everybody says this, right? But there's no appetite for us to be putting paywalls in front of the site to charge people for those resources. That's not the spirit with which the organization was set up. But as you said, bills do need to be paid. If we would paid the full market rate, we got some very good discounted rates, but had we paid the full market rate, just our hosting and bandwidth costs alone for the past year would have been about £2 million. So, there are some reasonably significant costs to cover. And, public ownership might be one way of squaring that circle. That said, we provided 130 million lessons. We have the same number of staff as the average primary school, and our budget is less than the average secondary school. So for the scope of the work, it works out about £80 per school in England, the cost of making this available to everybody, which, we think is really good value for money.
Yeah. Sorry to go on about this, but what would you personally like to see? Because you're giving it back to the government, the government, has now decided to fund 2 more terms. And, we'll see after that to see if there's public ownership, but what would you personally like it to be?
So, I think what I'm most interested in are these other use cases that we're seeing teachers take up. Right? Of course, I think it's perfectly sensible to have a backstop in place should schools close because of a variant or some other, God forbid, pandemic in the future. I think systems being resilient is a smart place to be. As a Boy Scout, we were always taught to be prepared. That's a very sensible place to be. But I think one of the things that I found frustrating when I was a teacher was, and I'm an economics teacher, but by training, was that there was not often enough focus on the opportunity cost of what we were asking teachers to do with their time. So yes, of course, I can spend loads of time making resources, for example. And although, that doesn't come with a cash cost, my salary is just being paid regardless of what work I do. It does come with an opportunity cost. And what I think we know is that the thing that teachers are uniquely well placed to do is to think about the thinking of the small human immediately in front of them, that last meter between them and the pupil, right? That's the bit that, AI, despite its promises, is still nowhere quite near. And the more time teachers are spending doing that, the better rested, frankly, teachers are, the more energy they bring to work in the morning, the better they're going to do at that job. And so I'm interested, first of all, in anything that reduces teacher time that's spent on things where the opportunity cost is too high. That doesn't mean to say I don't think planning and designing your lessons is really important. I think it is really important. I just think making the PowerPoint is probably not the best use of your time if there's one that's, perfectly suitable. So that's one area that I think is really interesting. The second thing that I think is really interesting is that one of the things that I would love to see more teachers spending time doing, again, this opportunity cost conversation, is being involved in some of the discussions that happened, last summer when we were creating these 10,000 lessons. We had groups of subject experts talking at length about their subject and what was going to be taught and what was the best sequence for that to be taught and where they were going to draw in particular connections and what was going to happen in individual lessons and how we were going to make sure that pupils had really mastered the content and how we're going to make sure they're really motivated to master the content. Teachers talking about teaching is a really good thing, and I would love to see Oak being a vehicle for more conversations about particular units that we teach, particular subjects that we teach. And we get feedback all the time from teachers, which is fantastic, saying, hey, I did this lesson on Oxbow Lakes. If the explanation was done in this way, it would reduce these misconceptions. Thanks for feedback, we'll re-record. There's a way, I think, of just harnessing the collective wisdom of lots more teachers, which is a mutual benefit, right? The collective benefit and those individuals benefit from more conversations about teaching.
Yeah. Well, you've answered my next question, because that question was, how can a teacher get involved? And which advice would you have for teachers who are listening to your story and basically say, hey, I want to do something as well for my peers? And your answer to that is basically join the conversation. Is that correct?
Yeah. Use the resources, give us some feedback. We would love that.
Nice. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for explaining that, Matt. We're almost at the end of this interview. Before we close off, I always ask 2 questions to all my guests. Question number 1 is around recommended reading. Well, what are you reading at the moment? Or alternatively, which book would you like to recommend to our listeners? So a book that inspired you.
There's a superb book by Peps McRae called Motivated Teaching that I'd recommend everybody have a read. He has basically delved into, on our behalf, what the literature tells us about motivation, what we actually know from high quality empirical studies, and what are the implications for that for us as teachers about creating the conditions where we can maximize the motivation of our pupils. I think that's really important in normal times, but it's been particularly important over the past year when, you know, we've been trying to motivate them at home without some of the peer effects and handy classrooms with desks facing the front that we have in a normal school building.
Great. So Peps McRae, thanks so much for that recommendation. And then the last question. Now let's turn the tables. This is your podcast series, and you can invite a guest. Who would you like to talk to?
That's a great question. So one of my favorite people to read, to listen to is Matthew Kraft. Matthew Kraft is an associate professor at Brown University in the US, and he, I think, does, again, going back to my roots here, interest in teacher professional development, he does some of the most important work into what, again, high quality empirical studies tell us about improving the expertise of teachers. And I think he is just steeped in the ins and outs of the literature on this, and is a really good person to pick the brains of whenever you are trying to figure out your way through this area of our education system that has, you know, historically been a little bit underserved by the research.
So Matthew Kraft. And
can I have two? Am I allowed two?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Really interesting to listen to is Benny Cara. She's a deputy head teacher in Derby, which is a town or city, I'm not sure, city I think, in the Midlands in the UK. She is superb on the answer to the question, what knowledge should we select to include within our curricula, and how do we make sure that it is diverse and represents the widest possible range of influences in any given society.
Benny Cara,
yeah. She's superb.
Good. Wow, that's a great recommendation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Thank you so much for being the driving force behind Oak National Academy, which helped millions of teachers and students in unprecedented times. I hope that we talk again in a year's time and talk about all the great things that Oak is still doing, and that it really will have a lasting impact on education in England and further into the United Kingdom. Matt Hood, thank you very much.
Thanks.
If you liked this episode of the Teach Pitch podcast, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Kevin MacLeod for our beautiful theme music, Le Grand Chase. This podcast was produced and edited by Natalie Piles. Project coordination by Inva Cheney.